The Organisation of Islamic Cooperation, or the OIC, has called on efforts to avert a complete economic collapse and a looming humanitarian catastrophe in Afghanistan. About 70 delegations of the OIC member states, non-member states and international institutions attended the 17th extraordinary session of the Council of Foreign Ministers of the OIC that was held in Pakistani capital of Islamabad. They discussed how the international community could work together to save Afghanistan's economy from collapse.
The meeting decided on establishing a humanitarian trust fund through which the Islamic Development Bank, together with other international institutions, could raise funds for assistance to Afghanistan. The delegates also urged the United States to lift its freeze on the overseas assets of the Afghan Central Bank so that the country's banking system can resume normal operations as soon as possible. At the meeting, Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan called on the Islamic world and the international community to provide aid to Afghanistan as soon as possible. He warned that extremist groups still have the ability to launch cross-border terrorist attacks and could take advantage of the chaos in Afghanistan. He said the Taliban has promised to abide by foreign conditions for lifting economic sanctions against Afghanistan. Imran Khan Muttaqi, acting foreign minister of the interim Afghan government, reiterated the Taliban's assurance to the world, especially Islamic countries, that the Afghan territory will not be used to attack anyone. He also stressed that the government will attach importance to the protection of human rights, women's rights, and to the participation of talents from different regions in governing the country.
Well, for some analysis, we're now joined by Zeenat Adam, who's the Deputy Executive Director for the Afro-Middle East Centre. Thanks so much indeed for joining us, Zeenat. I guess that since the Taliban took over in August, we were going to get to a point such as this where something had to be done.
Something still has to be done, Peter. The OIC is a wonderful organization, and the pledge for this fund is really indeed needed at this time when 22.8 million people are facing starvation. We're looking at the possibility of at least 1 million children losing their lives this winter. And the world is turning a blind eye to it. We've been getting these reports consistently from the United Nations, from various organs of the United Nations, from the World Food Programme. We've been hearing from Human Rights Watch and from people who are on the ground, Médecins Sans Frontières and others, that there is a dire situation and that this has been mounting, especially due to the free fall of the economy since the sanctions have been implemented. This pledge is not going to solve that problem because the sanctions are still there. And until the sanctions and the money is released by the United States and the IMF, literally the country cannot function. At the moment, there's some little funds that have trickled in the last week, enabling some civil servants to be paid, some of the hospitals to get some aid. But essentially what we're looking at is a created situation that is allowing for Afghanistan to turn into a horrible humanitarian catastrophe.
The question is then, why has the OIC taken so long to even get together over this issue?
I think there is a lot of debate around whether or not to give full recognition to the Taliban as the government, and the tacit approval seems to be there. Many of the countries have been working with the Taliban, talking to them, engaging them in talks, but no country in the world has yet taken the decision to say, yes, we acknowledge and we want to recognize officially the Taliban. So it has been a very difficult process. And remember, Peter, we're only 4 months into their rule. They took over, by accident almost on the 15th of August. And we've heard this week from the former president, Hamid Karzai, who was part of the intra-Afghan talks, indicating that he was the one who called on the Taliban to say, go and take over Kabul and the presidential palace because Ashraf Ghani, the former president, has upped and left with millions, and the country is going to be in complete devastation if there isn't a rule. So he's taken responsibility for part of that. And we're learning a lot about how these intra-Afghan talks have transpired and what they seek to get out of it. They're still continuing. There's still talks that are happening also between the Taliban and the EU, between the Taliban and the Americans, to try and find a resolution to this problem and to have those funds released and to have the country move towards some kind of normality. But I think we're still a long way off.
I'm told that the OIC is the second largest intergovernmental agency after the United Nations, and these are Muslim countries. And again, what is the reluctance to recognize the Taliban? Is it fear of repercussions? What is it?
I think that if we look at most of these countries, they have very strong relations with the Americans. And so until a move is made from that side, they're going to withhold some level of recognition. But in the meanwhile, many of the countries, especially those in the neighboring region to Afghanistan, have been in talks. One of the things that I recognized today is that Uzbekistan and Pakistan have recommitted to continuing with the building of the Trans-Afghan railway system, which was pledged before the Taliban took over. So there are some moves towards some assistance and some economic support, investments coming in from the neighboring countries. Saudi Arabia has also sent in quite a lot of humanitarian aid in this week. So there are certain moves towards that. But whether or not the OIC actually has that clout, or whether they have used the capacity that they have to apply that kind of pressure on the United Nations and on the United States, it has yet to be seen.
Talking about these sanctions, the United States, what needs to happen? What do they want to happen before they will consider lifting these sanctions?
Well, they've indicated that they want certain trust-building measures to be put in place, and it's not very clear. There is a lot of harping on about girls' education, and interestingly, today there was a major protest in Kandahar by Pashtun Afghan men standing out, protesting and saying, we want our daughters to go to school. There were protests earlier this week in Kabul by women saying, we do not want to continue to force ourselves to sell our children. I mean, this is how dire the humanitarian situation is. We want the education. The Taliban is not saying no to education, but there has been a little bit of a delay in terms of the governance issues and in terms of policy direction on how that is going to happen. We heard earlier last week from UNICEF that they were able to travel outside of Kabul to some of the villages. And interestingly, they also reported on several schools, girls' schools, were functioning in places that they were not previously, even under the American invasion. So there is slow progress, but this kind of information is taking a while to get to the rest of the world, and it's taking a while for the rest of the world to accept that there is a new sense of what Afghanistan will be in the future, even if it is under Taliban rule.
All right, so, I mean, this government, as you said, they've really only been in power for a few minutes in real terms. So they too are busy learning international relations and running government. Do you think that the Taliban are more than likely going to have to give some ground on some of these issues to progress?
Peter, the reports that I'm getting from independent organizations, including from the United Nations, is that the Taliban are really, really trying, and that they are making those concessions and they are engaging. We even heard that during the intra-Afghan talks before the Taliban took over, when there were women MPs involved in the discussions, that those women MPs were very much engaged and respected. Many of those chose to leave Afghanistan and are now in Greece, and they're looking at formulating a women's parliament outside of, in exile, basically. But some of them are choosing to go back to Kabul and choosing to go back to Afghanistan to engage the Taliban and to rebuild their country. So we are hearing that the Taliban are making those concessions, but the response has been slow from the international community. For me, I'm really wondering, leaving the economy in tatters as it is, where civil servants haven't been paid, where there has been a brain drain, where nurses are not being equipped, where hospitals are really falling apart, where we're hearing of men sitting on the side of the road selling the shoes off their feet in temperatures below zero, where children are being sold because people just don't have food to put on the table. This is not something that the CIA couldn't have predicted and don't have information on. So for me, I'm really wondering, are they expecting and hoping that there is going to be a complete collapse of Afghanistan before any intervention and before any move is made from their part? Because that's what it looks like to me.
When you've got more than 300,000 people fleeing to Pakistan alone, this is a regional issue, and that these countries, if they do nothing, it's coming to their back gardens.
It has been there for a long time. If we look at Pakistan, they suffered a lot even during the American invasion because a number of drone attacks had taken place in their territory as well. And again, here we're looking at no accountability for those kind of drone attacks on civilians, be they in Pakistan or in Afghanistan. In fact, the ICC lead prosecutor has indicated he will not be prosecuting or even investigating cases of American violations of human rights in Afghanistan. And this is really of concern because it shows that the international community is still biased. It shows that there is no accountability, that there is no human rights. But what we also need to look at is that if the economy and the governance of Afghanistan is going to continue to be in this free fall that it is, it creates a breeding ground for terrorist cells. And this is something that they really need to be looking at. And this could go across the region and even beyond. In some ways, it's almost as if the Americans want this to happen and want to turn around and say, well, you see, Afghanistan and the Taliban have not kept up to the agreement where they said they would prevent any terror attacks from their land. But it's really moving out of their hands. And the longer we wait and the longer people are forced into starvation, the more uprisings we can expect.
The West has been painting the Taliban in a certain way, and part of it, I guess, is a legacy of their first time at this and some of the things that they did back then. But as you say, things have changed, and I guess they're trying to convince the world that this is a new order. What is your gut feeling about Afghanistan and its future under the Taliban, because it does seem they're here to stay for quite some time?
They were there all along. They're part of the people. They are organic to Afghanistan. So you're not going to get rid of them by bombing them out of the surface of the earth. That's not going to happen. It hasn't happened in the 20 years. So there has to be a different way of approaching the situation. And I think that one of the things we have to recognize is that these delegations that are being sent from the West are as wrong in terms of the way in which they're approaching this, because for instance, there's been deep criticism of a delegation sent from the UK recently to meet with the Taliban to talk about opening the women's schools. Not one woman was part of this delegation. Now, that already shows you if the UK is not sending any women to talk about women's issues, what kind of signal are we sending to the Taliban? It doesn't make sense. And the excuse that the Taliban is not talking to women doesn't hold water, because almost all of the international organizations, the WFP, the United Nations, UNICEF, are led by women and have been working in Afghanistan and are getting access to the Taliban. In addition to that, the Taliban are open to interviews with Afghan women who are journalists, and they've been meeting with them, sitting in the same room. Last week, there was a meeting with Afghan women at the headquarters as well of the Taliban. So For the UK to be sending a delegation without women to talk about women's issues is actually an insult to every woman on the planet. And I think that that mindset needs to change. The other thing that needs to change is to understand what Sharia is. There has been this malignant view of what the concept of Islamic law is. Now, I'll give you an example, Peter, especially when it comes to the women's issue. Last week, the Taliban issued a decree and a reminder that women have the authority and the right to choose their partners. They cannot be forced into any marriages. They cannot be forced into any situations that they are not comfortable with. This is a Sharia ruling. It has been there for over 1400 years in terms of Islamic principles. What it was by the Taliban last week was a reminder to those very tribal societies that have not been abiding by that and have had non-Islamic practices of almost selling off women or forcing women into marriage. And so the Taliban is correcting that and empowering the women as well. We need to give recognition where it is. We also need to criticize where necessary. And we do know that at the lower ranking levels, the Taliban still doesn't have a stronghold on how those individuals are acting out and are perpetrating various crimes. We know that there are at least 47 people, according to Human Rights Watch, who have disappeared forcibly. And this is a concern. And so we need to also hold the Taliban to account to that, but give recognition where it is necessary.
All right, so there's a middle ground, certainly. All right, Zeenat, we'll leave it there for today. Let's hope that the people that really need the help, and there's ordinary citizens on the ground, get the assistance that they need despite the politics that might be happening around them. Thank you so much for joining us.